Last time we discussed the massive antique Gasser 1870 revolver and its role in the Great War. Today we'll talk about something of a cultural icon that was just about banned from Montenegro. Hi, I'm Othais, and this ugly son of a gun is an approximation of a copy of a gun that we care about for the Great War. This is what you would technically call a Montenegrin. Now, this is a Belgian-produced example, unlike the technically Austrian-produced example we're really concerned about today. But those are excruciatingly rare, and these are excruciatingly common. So let's go ahead and get a closer look at it and talk about what the heck's going on with this gun. Weighing in at 2.8 pounds and almost 10.5 inches in length, this beefy 5-shot deals out 11 millimeters of lead packed into a former carbine case. This is going to be an interesting episode because a lot of what you know about this gun is dead wrong, and it's not necessarily your fault. They've been poorly researched. But to get there, we first have to talk about some participants of the Great War that few are familiar with. The Montenegrins. Now, these guys, they can be difficult to explain, so to kick things off, I've found a passage I'm rather fond of. It comes from an 1881 travel write-up by one Othais and Mae. I think that's his real name. The Montenegrin is a fighting man, or he is nothing, never having been taught any peaceable pursuits, and reared as he has been from childhood only to the use of arms. In peace, as in war, his girdle is full of silver-ornamented artillery and decorated offensive cutlery. He is a walking magazine of murderous weapons. Under his red Morocco pouch or colon lurks the long, heavy, 6-chambered Gasser-Revolver, with a barrel a foot in length and capable, when used over the left arm by way of arrest, of bringing down a man at 500 yards. Alright guys, a lot of you may be obsessed with EDC, everyday carry, but I'm gonna say the Montenegrins had us beat right at the start. And while it's fun to have a lighthearted chuckle at their bristling armament, there really was a reason for the armed citizenry. You see, tiny Montenegro had long been a sort of independent pseudo-theocracy led by the Petrovic family and nominally under the Ottoman control. In 1852, it was declared a principality under Danilo I. In 1858, this matter was punctuated by a successful war with the Turks, forcing the world to officially recognize Montenegro's borders. Now, Danilo was a martial man, and while Montenegro had a long militia tradition, he really helped to cement that into the national identity. By example, in 1855, he established this law: he who retires or shows fear in the face of the enemy is no more worthy to bear arms. The women ought to tie an apron upon him and chase him out of the country. Okay, I think we're getting a taste of the culture in this period in this country. In 1860, Prince Nicola would become the head of the state following the assassination of Uncle Danilo. Nicola would further formalize the Montenegrin militia, tightening laws around service and personal armament. The structure was pretty straightforward. All able-bodied men were part of the national militia. At or around age 18, they would receive 4 to 6 months training. If you opted for that 6-month training, you were eligible to be an officer. The state provided food and housing during the training, and they would issue a rifle to each man. Now, with that came 60 rounds. They were provided for the practice during the training itself, and when you went home, you were given a packet of 20 that you were supposed to keep on hand. You could purchase private ammunition and use your rifle to further practice, but you had to have 20 in case of a war. Now, there was no real standing army, but at any given time, 2 battalions would be online, mostly in order to act as a training body for everybody else. Now, once out of training, you were generally in one of 3 tiers based on age group. Men 18 or 19 years of age were in that sort of recruitment phase. From 20 to 50 years old was the active army, and the reserve kicked in at 51 through 60 years old. There was no active cavalry, as Montenegro didn't really have the land to favor cavalry battles. There were 2 batteries of horse-drawn artillery though, and in 1907 a 60-man machine gun section was established, although that's a bit further ahead than we are in our conversation now. If this all seems a bit ad hoc, you're right. The bulk of martial training was actually passed down from father to son in Montenegro, and annual refreshers were held at the village level. While this might not seem like an impressive way to run an army, it did work for a rather poor nation, making it pretty indigestible for any of its neighbors. I mean, the expense that you had to spend to get a hold of Montenegro was not worth Montenegro. In any given war, the entire male population would be armed and ready to fight, unless there was a war against the Ottomans. At that point, any Mohammedans were excused from service so long as they paid a fee or tax. Turning back to Nikola, I hear a lot of talk about him requiring revolvers for all his male subjects, and that's likely true in a legal sense, but it's probably not as cut and dry as you think. It seems the average Montenegrin was already carrying a pistol before Nikola's decree, and likely he just standardized the practice on specific pattern. That came about because of a trip to Vienna in May of 1873. This was at the time of the World Exhibition, and Nikola was attending to catch the ear of the Russian Emperor. He wanted to get a loan for road construction and additional armament for his country, and he did succeed in that regard. And since he had some cash to burn, specifically for guns, and he was in Austria, well, he took the advice of a local captain and tried out the Gasser. Now, overall, he was enthused with the gun, and in June of 1873, he contracted for 6,000 of the things. Now, we are, by the way, talking about this guy, the 1870. These were dead copies of it, and they only had one key difference. The standard at Austria had a 7.2-inch barrel. Nikola wanted 9 1/4 inch. Gasser was happy to sell them for 19 guilders a pop. Over time, Nikola would create laws that men must own one of these Gasser revolvers, and at this point, history is a little unkind. It's been said that he owned part of the Gasser company, which is why he enforced a Gasser-only policy, and I can find no evidence of that. The truth is more likely that if everyone was required to be part of the militia, then there should be some sort of standardization of armament. That's just sensible. I will say, however, that the government of Montenegro was the exclusive arms importer for the entire nation, meaning that the government saw a markup on every citizen-bought gun, which is likely where we get the inclusion of a monogram over the top of the action, although not present on this one. That would represent Nikola on every gun bound for Montenegro. Either way, the floodgates were open. Not only did Johann Gasser begin to sell into Montenegro, but a number of Belgian copycats got to work. Well, these revolvers, plus some Berdan and Werndl rifles, and Montenegro was pretty ready for a fight. So when a number of political fallouts resulted in 1875, we see an uprising in Herzegovina. Montenegro started pumping cash and guns into the region. This upset the Ottomans and resulted in the Montenegrin-Ottoman War of 1876 through 78. Ultimately, Russia would intervene, and thanks to its pan-Slavic leanings, put pressure on the Ottomans. This resulted in the 1878 Treaty of Berlin, which formalized the sovereign borders of Montenegro, along with, by the way, Romania and Serbia, and kind of Bulgaria. Following this conflict, Montenegro went in search of a cheaper supplier of the Gasser because they felt they needed more, and they really didn't want to spend a lot of cash. This is when they found Steyr, and it is likely why he tooled up production of the 7074 in the first place, selling it to the Montenegrins as early as 1879, although just a few hundred guns at this point, he was hoping for more sales later. Still, this panicked Johann Gasser. He would offer discount down to 14 guilders a pop, but no orders emerged until 3 whole years later. In 1882, they contracted for 14,000 model 1870 74s. These again were bought for 14 guilders and sold at home for 15.3 to up to 18 guilders depending on the year. Montenegrin men could keep their Gassers purchased from the state, and they could hand them down to sons as inheritance, but private sale, domestic or foreign, was prohibited. Right about here, we need to take a break from Montenegro for the next bit to make any sense. So we're going to turn away from this gun, kind of back to this one, and talk about Johann Gasser. You see, he wanted a new revolver to be introduced into the Austro-Hungarian army, one that would be fast-loading and modern in design and sold by him. He worked on this until the model 1877, and, well, I should say he borrowed ideas until the model 1877. This came from US and Liège gunsmiths. The new top-brake Gasser was just what the army had wanted, and they officially adopted it September 5th, 1877. There was almost no production though, because he apparently had tripped over a patent or two and was finally coming back around on him. He could not produce the gun he had promised to produce for the government, and it's likely that this is the situation that burned that bridge that we talked about last episode. He'd try again and again to get another top brake adopted, this time dodging patents, but I'm not so sure what's going on, because if we skip ahead, we'll see the final attempt was the 1882, and while it certainly looks really unique, it's built on stolen ideas, same as ever. That lever on the side, well, it was patented in Britain by Price, which is how most people recognize it, but actually, you see this design even earlier on Frankot's again, so we've come full circle. I have trouble running down the earliest possible patent in this era, but it appears that the gun was the work of August Frankot, licensing a patent from one Philippe Cornet. So yeah, it looks like Johann wasn't going to win this one. A handful of other models would be tried, but they were going nowhere. Well, maybe not nowhere. Private purchases were actually trickling along, but nowhere near the numbers he needed to stay on top of the market like he had with the 74. If he wasn't going to win the overall dual monarchy, maybe he could lure in some good sales from Montenegro instead, so he'd redirect his efforts into a gun specifically for them, something very simple and very rugged. And in 1883, he'd come up with what is essentially this, but better made. This guy will have to do now, though, in order for you to see what's going on. So let's take a closer look. Ooh, that is a lot of revolver. So definitely smaller than the 1870/74 series, but still very beefy. Now, let's talk about what's similar. This gun is still the general rear profile all the way through the frame here, and we have a gate loader with a simple spring clip. We have 5 shots instead of 6. That's our first big difference. Close that back up. Those are still 11 by 36 millimeter Werndl carabiner sized cartridges, although not necessarily for that gun. Although this one would hold together a lot better because it has the top strap. That's the other big critical difference, giving this gun a lot more rigidity. Since it also takes some of that weight off that center pin, we'll see another change in a moment. But first, let's reaffirm. We have single and we have double action on this revolver. And you may notice that this is in particularly rough condition. This is not a Gasser-made gun. This is a Belgian copy. Specifically, if you guys can make it out down there, patented plastic and pokey, right in here you may see an MF with a crown. That is not King Mother something. That is actually the mark of the Belgian Liège gunsmith. I don't know that he personally was Belgian because his name was Max Fliegerschmidt. So Max Fliegerschmidt did a lot of these guns. You'll actually see MF on a lot of these Belgian copies of different designs. He did an okay job. He's not like the premier Liège gunsmith by any means, but the guns hold together pretty well. I will say, I suspect that this gun is all iron, is extremely soft. And we know that because Mark did some work to get this gun into time. And so when we shoot this on the range, you may notice that Mae is wiggling the cylinder back and forth here and there, because essentially the way the timing is set up on this gun, we have now favored perfect lockup on what is no longer a perfectly circular, perfectly set up gun. And since we favored the lockup, we fell out of time for the pickup. Well, lockup is what we care about because that's going to prevent us from having a failure of the system that would hurt somebody. Pickup just means that every once in a while you go to pull the trigger or pull the hammer back and it just doesn't want to rotate until you wiggle the cylinder just right. So we favored that. These guns are almost universally in unshootable condition when you get them. This is one of 2 that we have laying around here, and neither were what I would consider safe out of the box. If you have not had a very qualified gunsmith inspect and handle the gun, Do not try to shoot these Belgian clones. I have heard the Gasser originals are much better quality. I have not laid hands on one. All of them, I would say, need a special eye when dealing with a large bore like this. It's a potential hazard. I just want to say that when I normally don't, because these are particularly possibly dangerous and particularly common in the collector's market. So unlike everything else that we see that's either so rare that you can't really get into it without knowing what you're doing, or it's common but extremely safe, these are common and possibly dangerous. So be warned. All right, so when we look back at the gun, sorry for all that ranting, we have one very key change, and that is in how we unload. So in this particular gun, let me get her back to that proper position. Again, hammer block safety. We now have an ejector rod that is set forward. This is actually part of an Adams patent. This is from the younger Adams, and it was first involved on the 1872 Mark III. Looking back at it though, we just pull her out, pop her over, and then we would have aligned our empty chamber, popped her back. That would get our casing out. We can then bring her forward, tuck her over, pop her back. This beats the pants off of that little turn screw that we saw in the 1870. And it also gives us an option for taking down the gun because with the top strap, we are now reinforced here and here as our yoke for sort of the detonation of this gun. So when you fire it, you know, parts of it want to go forward, like the cylinder and the barrel, and parts of it want to go back, like the frame itself. Well, that's all being held together by a top strap and this lower part of the frame, instead of being borne down a central pin, like had previously been done on this guy, where she's open top, so all of that comes to the central pin. Since we're not relying on the central pin to provide all of our yoke strength to disassemble this gun, we can actually pop this guy out. Let me flip her over so you can see right here. See this little guy right there? We're gonna bop him out. Now in a perfectly fit gun, you'd be able to just yank it clear. And we'll see this on other revolver designs in the war. This, however, again, is a sort of sloppy mixed master part Belgian gun. I'm gonna be a little rough on her to get that out. Oh, good Lord. Yeah, this gun was made up of at least 2 others that I've been able to tell from the serial numbers present, and it is extremely stiff. Give me one moment. I'm actually gonna get this into a position where I have some leverage. And still, still struggle. All right, so I just pulled out that central axis pin, set that down where you can see it. The gun now is free with that gate out of your way to let that cylinder out. There's our 5-shot. And again, very crude at this point. It was probably very fine when it was made, but being an iron design and surviving over 100 years, she's definitely taken on some wear. Not an ideal handgun, but at the time, very affordable, very powerful, and certainly, I imagine, when new and timed, actually quite a lovely single and double action handgun readily available in the market. Okay, so overall, I want to be clear. This gun smacks of more piracy. It really feels like it's not a Johann Gasser original, but I don't know. Trying to track these old patents has become a real problem with a show like ours where we're trying to produce something every 2 weeks. So if anybody out there happens to be interested in this sort of thing, especially if you're in Belgium and you have experience with the archives, I would highly recommend doing some digging, because I think there's a lot of lost revolver history, very interesting revolver history. And what it's going to come down to is comparing Austrian, British, and Belgian in particular patents. Those 3 countries have a lot of sort of tossing ideas around in a circle, and it's not always easy to tell who should get the credit, because a lot of times the Belgians were the first to rush to market, or the British were the first to rush to patent, or whatever. So that, to me, is sort of like the great undiscovered country for firearms names and designers, and I think a lot of it gets brushed aside because people don't really see the differences in these revolvers. And I'm starting to, the more we get in the series, see some very significant differences in terms of how the actions work, in terms of how the accessories work, assembly, that sort of things. These are things that we would count as distinct differences in semi-automatic handguns, and we just don't think that way about revolvers because we feel like we understand them. The thing goes up and it turns around and the hammer falls down, and we don't think about them like we think about other guns. So if you are the kind of person who's curious about that, please reach out to me. I'd love to know someone that's interested in researching that field and maybe provide some help. So this gun internally, mechanically, works just the same as the 1870 and 74 that we saw last time, so there's no real need to go to an animation. Instead, we'll kick this straight over to Mae and let her, well, chance quite a bit by going ahead and firing this abomination. bit of a, oh God, chore to shoot. Normally I wouldn't dry fire, but this thing's about gone. And I have some bad news for you people who are fans of these as being Montenegrins. There's very, very little chance that this gun or anything like it ever went to Montenegro. You see, they rejected this pattern. I mean, they loved basically 4-foot long barrels. They wanted bigger. This isn't a big enough barrel. They wanted bigger. And this little guy, he's not going to cut it, not with 5 shots in a short barrel. Montenegrin men could, however, buy one of these as a second gun, a privately purchased trinket and not a weapon of war, but only if they already had the long gun. And woe be unto them for anybody who pulled something like this out of their sash despite the long barrel. By the way, while I have this, I'd like to make a further point, so let's go ahead and take a closer look. So, zooming in, yeah, this is an extremely wild looking gun. I know everybody's gonna love this one at home. I mean, look at the size of that. That is a Montenegrin barrel, by the way. These is like a 9¼ inch barrel. This is what, so imagine that on one of these, and that's what the Montenegrins were carrying around, right? Well, this guy is this is another one that gets called a Montenegrin all the time, okay? But really, what you're looking at is an overall Frankot style single double action center fire, just like the Gasser is, but then it uses this unique breech lock with these dual pins. Now this, again, has been credited to say like Price or someone like that in Britain, but as far as I can tell, and again, we need to do more research whenever possible, but as far as I can tell, the first person that has claim to this is a man, Philippe Connet, who worked with Frankot. So again, this would be almost considered, if you wanted to name this gun, if you had to give it a name, you would call this the Frankot Connet. Now, I'm going to bring her back down though. Let's just get a look at this thing because this guy is broken. I mean, this thing is made out of pot metal. Everything's tied up, everything's chewed up. Don't worry about it. All I want you to see though is it's very common to encounter Montenegrin pattern guns with this particular lock style in the collector's market. So you would pinch both of these pins release, that allows you to pop this guy forward. Now, if she weren't so dejected, and I might even be able to trick her into doing it, there we go. She'll have a, the barrel's so long I can't even put this where you guys can see it. She'll have a simultaneous ejection, pop back down. Now again, this has a broken internal spring. This has, I mean, you can see, by the way, if you want to talk about just a really rough revolver, all of our sort of front of the trigger function is visible. I'm trying really hard to get where you guys can see this. All that's visible down in here, and there would be a flat V-spring that's now missing from this action. That was, you can tell why it's missing. It was so exposed that of course it was gonna come flying out. And just for the hilarity of it, if I pull this lock pin on the left side, right there, you guys gotta look at that. And if I just sort of, yeah, that's gonna get lost. I'm amazed that's made it 100 years with the gun. So she's worn, she's busted, but dang is she cool looking, and she's really indicative of what you're going to see from these sort of quote-unquote Montenegrin guns. So generally, whenever somebody encounters a Gasser-looking revolver, like this, or like this, you're gonna think that they're going to be Montenegrins. And again, let me just get a little close-up, but the funny truth is, they really aren't, and there's a good reason for that. I mean, for a limited time, maybe like 7 years, okay, Montenegrins could have bought these, but by 1885, the War Ministry was getting annoyed at these cheap decorative copies with all their fragile embellishments, and so they issued some directives. First banning fancy grips, like these are actually horn grips, instead saying that they had to be made out of wood and only wood. And in 1891, the Belgian clones, these particular style of guys, they were banned as well for poor quality. Only Austrian Gassers would do. And even then, you had to pick a standard model. So not this, but one of these guys with a longer barrel. That's it. And so by 1901, that option to have your secondary revolver, so yeah, I have one of these, so therefore I can own one of these, that was done away with as well. These are out the door. So a passage from the 1903 book, The Land of the Black Mountain, actually points to this Montenegrin preparedness for their revolvers. The revolver is always worn by all classes alike and carried loaded by order. The upper classes carry a much smaller and handier weapon, but a revolver must be carried by prince and peasant alike. Prince Nicholas himself will often stop a man at haphazard on the road and examine his weapons, and woe betide him if his revolver is carried empty. Every chamber but one must be loaded. So that tells you something, right? Like, they care, they're inspecting. So if you pull something like this out, they'll be happy about the barrel, but not much else. You'll get in trouble. However, you did hear it. You did hear it in that quote that the upper classes managed to get away with smaller weapons. So maybe there's a few of these still around by 1903. Anyway, turning back to Johann, he wasn't doing so hot. The 1883 bid to get Montenegro onto a new pattern had obviously failed. So he would market in Europe and the rest of the Balkans with his little gun, which he still named, despite not being adopted, the Montenegrin. And just like half of those army and police revolvers you hear about out there, it's never adopted by the army police, this was never adopted by the Montenegrins. And if you're curious as to just why there's so many of these guns and others out there that are decorated and in wild configurations, kind of like this guy, well, you can blame Albania. I can't seem to find a single photo of a Montenegrin with a decorated revolver or a single photo of an Albanian without an over-decorated revolver. These guns were also popular in Greece, Serbia, and even Turkey. And in all those places, again, you could sell these fancy guys. So as a matter of fact, we've handled at least one Ottoman contract Gasser, like this guy, fitted with a Montenegrin length barrel and chambered for 44 rimfire because of the Ottoman use of the Winchester 1866 cartridge. So while Johann had some buyers, he didn't have this sort of super loyal base. They would just buy Belgian stuff, so he didn't make a ton of money. So he fathered a son, named him Hans, before his wife Leopoldine passed away in 1884. He would remarry and have a daughter. Both of these children were underage when he too passed away in 1896, never really rebirthing the Gasser name. He must have known this was coming, as in 1894 he reconsolidated the company into private ownership and set up a myriad of sort of if-then directions for what would happen if this or that happened. The result is that before anyone could lay claim to the crumbling empire, Leopold Gasser, the company, had dissolved quietly. This happened in 1903, although the buyers did carry on selling Gassers until at least 1905 under the Gasser name. From here, I'm not sure what Montenegro did for their revolvers because the supplier is gone. I've come across a few photos, however, featuring what appear to be Smith & Wesson No. 3s, but that seems likely to be a step back. In Austria-Hungary, the Gasser name would be carried on by Johann's younger brother, as we talked about last time and in a previous episode, Michael. He was the one who helped develop the Rast and Gasser 1898 that would be adopted by the home country. This would obviously replace the 7074, and it would appear Rast and Gasser got a hold of some of the old big bore parts though, because they would turn out to actually make a few more of these guys after war were declared. Woo, that is the long way around to come back to this exact gun. First and foremost, let's clear Montenegro from our plate though. They declared war on Austria on the 7th of August and Germany on the 9th. To coordinate with their allies, the Serbians, they worked under General Vazadar Jankovic, and he was named head of command for both armies. Supplies were sent from France and later Italy, but these became infrequent thanks to attacks by Albanian irregulars, so hey, maybe. Mount Lovsen proved to be Montenegro's best defense for a while, making for a drawn-out artillery duel. Honestly, I urge anyone watching to stop and take a good read of the Montenegrin campaign as a whole. It's interesting how long this little militia army managed to stand up all the way until December of 1915, when the combined Austro-Hungarian, German, and Bulgarian invasion finally broke Serbia and Montenegro. Montenegrins still helped cover the retreat of the Serbians even as their country was being overrun through January, and finally fell to occupation for the rest of the war. Now, of course, all of this was done with a slightly longer barrel version of this 1870, or the near identical 7074, again with a long barrel. That's not quite this guy here. So that begs the question, if it wasn't really all that present in World War I, why would we bother making a whole episode about this guy? Well, it turns out that the Austrians and apparently some Germans did make use of the Montenegrin pattern. Due to shortages, the Austro-Hungarian Military Technical Committee acquired surplus Montenegrins in this pattern that had sat partially assembled at Rast and Gasser. They had held the inventory of the old defunct company. These became known as the Landwehrrevolvers and came in two general configurations, one like this with a top strap and one without. These guns were already marked with the export sign of Crown N, which again reveals that this was done at the factory to every dang commercial Gasser, just in case they went to Montenegro. They're also marked with an LW and the acceptance date, usually 15 or 16 for 1915 or 16. How the Germans ended up with them, I'm a bit less sure, but I found at least photo of Germans with the same thing. Now, our example today is much, much rougher than these Gasser-made guns would have been, but sadly, we don't have one of those on hand. And this thing, I think, proved the point well enough. It really shows the worst possible version of the gun, and we already saw what a good Gasser does. So let's do this. Let's go ahead, and we've heard Mae's opinion on this gun, and effectively, what was used by the Landwehr, what really saw World War I, were versions of this with a top strap or not. But we can play pretend. We can do two things. We can talk about, you know, this oddity in and of itself, because boy is it unique, and without the historical context we can just sort of have some fun with this gun in her opinion. But also we can get her to kind of project if she would prefer something that worked like this in this particular configuration. So let's just go get her opinion on what would be at best a Landwehrrevolver, but otherwise is a very interesting commercial handgun. All right, once more we've made room for Mae, and this time we have a slightly more compact Montenegrin Gasser, I guess, because I still haven't been able to pin down that Gasser was the true originator of this form on top of everything else. I mean, he stole a lot of stuff from Frankot, apparently. Again, history to be discovered, but either the Belgians worked this up or Gasser worked it up and the Belgians copied it. This particular one is a Belgian copy, and we'll get it over into Mae's hands. There you go. She, at the risk of life and eyeballs, shot this thing. So why don't you give us your take on handling this particular gun?
You know, I don't know what the official name should be for this gun, but I'm going to call it Lumpy Jenkins. And it is indeed that, gentlemen. Look at this thing. I mean, it's a big honkin' revolver. It's not quite as big as the Gasser 1870, obviously, but it is still very big. There is a good bit of weight to it. And the balance point on it feels slightly off. Like, it feels like, I mean, granted, all the weight is forward of your hand, but it does feel like it is tipping forward a little bit. And maybe that's because the grip isn't quite steep enough. Maybe it's because the knuckle isn't quite big enough or doesn't have as acute of an angle to it. Don't really know, but it does feel a little bit front heavy. At least now I've got a top strap. Like, a top strap is great. That makes the revolver stronger, so appreciating that. There are some still finicky features to it, though, especially with this ejection rod. I mean, this one even looks bent. Like, and talk about flimsy. Like, it's just hanging out there. Like, you can just see it wiggling in the camera right there. That's actually pretty bad. Obviously, unloading still incredibly slow. Yeah, as far as ergonomics goes, this is a very rough looking gun. It's, like I said, it's lumpy, it's janky, it's got all sorts of issues with it.
Yeah, you would think that if you can reduce size down from this and add a top strap, you're just gonna have a better gun overall. But I wanna warn going into this, this is not a Gasser made gun. This is a Belgian clone that has slightly different angles and slightly different fit and was probably handmade to a very strong degree. So chances are, if you had the Gasser version of this, which we don't, it would feel just as good as the 1870 and be a little less muzzle heavy, a little more compact, a little narrower around the cylinder because we're down to 5 shots instead of 6. So all that with a grain of salt. We are describing what we have in our hands, which is the fairly poor, at the time it was made, probably not that poor, but definitely aged poorly Belgian copy. So again, careful, because we're not making a judge on what would be ultimately the Landwehrrevolver, which was the nicest possible version of this. We're talking about what is available. So with that in mind, let's talk about actually shooting this thing. What happens when you pull the trigger?
Yeah, first off, I'm going to light up my sights, and that's quite difficult because there's like a vague sense of a sight there. There's a vague notion of it, but the problem is that Yeah, the front sight's really tall. That's great, fantastic, no problem there. The problem is the rear sight is what's vague. It's just a gentle U-shape into the back. And by gentle, I mean gentle, gentlemen. Like it is just very, it's not steep at all. So you can wiggle on in there, but yeah, good luck if your accuracy's spot on with this one. That's a difficult one. And then the hammer on this one, still pretty difficult in case you couldn't tell in the footage. And unfortunately with this gun in particular, I thought I mentioned it in the video, like it just every once in a while the cylinder did snag, in which case I would have to make sure I rotated just ever slightly to the left to make sure to get it lined right up on the spot in order to actually move the cylinder. And I mean, I could probably move it and get it. I was wondering if I could break it right here on camera, but no, apparently now it's just gonna function fine. Cool, I'm not shooting it and it functions just fine. Of course that makes sense.
I will point out, you're able to work the hammer on this one better than the original 1870.
I will say, yes, I am, and maybe that's because it's got a shorter grip. Maybe it's because it is a smaller gun overall, technically. Maybe it's just in the right range, but yeah, unfortunately still not easy.
No, and by the way, that advantage disappears the minute you fire it because the actual cases in there get butted up against the back plate and start dragging, and that's a lot of friction added to the whole lot.
It gets worse as you continue to shoot it. It's great.
Yeah, every round makes it just slightly worse to shoot. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. You were about to talk about double action, I believe.
Yeah, getting right into the trigger. You know, honestly, I thought the Gasser 1870 was pretty bad, but this one is actually worse. It's amazing. Great job. You made one that was worse, and I've got one less cartridge on top of that, so woo. Anyway, recoil, about the same as the Gasser 1870. It's still pretty significant. Still didn't enjoy it great. I can only imagine what shooting the carbine cartridge out of this one would be. Hopefully I never will have to. But yeah, shooting-wise, not my favorite. Couldn't tell exactly where I was aiming. Had a hard time with the trigger. Didn't have the best time with this revolver in general because this one, unfortunately, in particular, like I said, it had that little quirk where I had to twist the cylinder just slightly to the left to get it right perfectly timed with firing. Just not my favorite overall.
Okay, so you're manually checking the cylinder. You have no real rear sight. You have terrible recoil, slow loading. I'm going to guess you're going to give this all 5 stars for taking it into the Great War. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Are you kidding me? I mean, this was an improvement. No. It's got all of those negatives to it. There's actually, everything about it is slightly worse than what the Gasser 1870 was. So, I mean, except for the hammer. I guess technically the hammer was a little easier to manipulate, but and it is smaller technically. There's a little less weight to it, but everything else was so much worse.
I can imagine a hammer is probably easier because we've had 100 years of a poorer quality spring getting worn in.
Yeah, you just gotta, use it for 100 years and then you're fine. You're fine.
I would never carry one of these Belgian clones into the war, I agree with you, but I'm gonna use my imagination for a moment and I invite you to do the same. This Atom-style ejector is essentially what we find on a number of revolvers that we have handled or are about to handle, like most famously the Nagant. We're going to talk about those. They use this style, and when it's tight and when it works, it's actually not the worst thing in the world. I still think it's a bit delicate, but it's not a bad ejection system. It's probably an improvement over the original.
Oh, I would agree.
Yeah, so that's fine. In terms of the action, if it were just like the Gasser, then it would be very advanced for 1870, and with the top strap and everything. Again, this gun's coming out 1882, 1883 into the market. We won't see things like the Bodeo until 1889. However, we're already starting to see things like the Chamelot Delvines. So it's a bit behind some, but certainly comparable with others that were still yet to come. It's not a terribly dated system for that time period. Made by Gasser, made by a company that had everything figured out and was doing it on actual machine tooling with some hand fitting. I feel like I would actually feel pretty confident about a gun like this. Not my favorite for taking in the Great War, slow loader, things like that, but would I bet my life on something like this made by the appropriate company, not the way it is?
Made by the appropriate company, yeah, I would imagine it would have lasted much longer, and also it would have been just in better condition overall.
Yeah, and then the good thing about this with the top strap, if it was made of steel, made by the good company, one of the advantages here is that you could use the full-powered carbine cartridge out of the revolver without risking yourself. So
No.
good rear sight,
No.
I could have a carbine cartridge
No.
in a handgun.
No.
So that way, if I'm in the trench, now you gotta think about these things, okay? Heavy wool coats, trench fighting, you're in the trench, or you're attacking a trench, it doesn't matter. Trenches are narrow and they go on for maybe 50 feet before they turn a corner, right? So the problem with is, I understand you only have 5 shots, but think about this advantage of having a carbine cartridge in this. You just have to wait for that moment when 5 of the opposition come at you in a line because it's a narrow trench, and then you get 5 for 1. So you just go ahead and fire, it'll go through all of them. When they go down, you wait, you fire your next round. I mean, think of it. You go from, 6 shots, maybe 6 guys if you're lucky with some of these smaller bore revolvers. But if you plan with this one carefully, I mean, 5 times 5, it's like 25 guys with 1 cylinder, all right? This is some very high level tactics.
He's just gonna be like, number 4, can you scoot a little to the left? Yeah, okay, thank you.
All right, look, once in a while you only get 2 or 3 of them to line up. It's still a very good revolver. Obviously, I would select this as my #1 pick for the war. Let's be honest. All right, so certainly though, joking aside, not actually the worst thing technologically to get dragged into the war if it's in good condition, like if it's made by a good company.
If it's in good condition, made by a decent company, I'll give you that. It's not the worst.
And all we're really doing is adding a better ejection system, and we're adding a top strap to the original Gasser 1870, and that is certainly enough to take this black powder gun from 1870 and put it in the same category as a lot of the handguns that were still around for the Great War that we've already talked about that were large bore black powders. So that gives you an idea of how very close to mold making this gun was, how advanced this gun was in 1870, despite how horribly antiquated it looks to us nowadays. And it just puts into some better context. But this came out a decade later and there was better technology available. Still though, I would put this above average in terms of a revolver for like 1882, 1883. I really would.
I will give you that. Still not great.
And I will also add one other bit, which is that we keep saying if it were made by Gasser, right? Well, let me give some deference to the Belgians. Number 1, some firms like Frankot could make one of these in very good quality. Number 2, yes, they were made out of iron and inferior materials were available and they wore out very quickly because of that, but they're also very affordable to the common man. So at that time, if you wanted a very powerful handgun for your own personal use in Europe, this is the lowest cost option probably. This is a very easy way for you to have a very powerful handgun inexpensively from it'd be reliable. It'd be reliable for the first 20, 30 years.
Which is realistically all you would need for that time frame.
Yeah, I mean, this is the high point of its era and it would have gone bang and it would have worked. So you can't, as much as you want to make fun of it.
I can discount it now. The problem is that at that time it probably was a pretty decent option.
And it was designed, by the way, for the Montenegrin market, where it was supposed to be inexpensive and yet combat ready. I think that counts as success. I don't want to make too much fun of it because that's what it was designed for and that's what it accomplished. So as much as we're sort of like having a laugh at the poor condition of this thing 100 years later, and collectors, please don't shoot these things. I know we did be very competent of what you're doing. I mean, you heard me discuss how it ended up only working in one direction once we fixed it. So know what you are doing before you shoot these guns. But at their time, I would give them a lot of praise. I don't want to spit on them from great height. That's
fair. Honestly, it'd be a unique thing to be able to try one in its prime, I suppose. It's just it's not an option, unfortunately, available because now they're all just so far gone.
Oh, I'd be happy to borrow a Gasser-made one if somebody has one out there.
Oh, that would be neat, yeah.
But anyway, that's going to wrap us up, right? No other opinions on this one?
Nope, pretty much it. It's unfortunate that I can't try one that's in better condition, but sadly, that was probably decent for what's out there right now for that one, unless it's Gasser-made.
Yeah. So, well, thank you all for tuning in. Updates after the credits, and have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
All right, gang, I am frankly exhausted and sore because I have spent 6 days on range pretty much for all the light available in these horrible winter months because 3 of those were spent with a guest from Forgotten Weapons. You may know this guy, Ian. And then the rest we've been gathering B-roll. And I still got to go out and do more of that. But I also have to make sure regular episodes are flowing, so I had to come back to the house long enough to do some more research. So what's happening is February 14th, you will see what is known as Project Lightning, in which we have managed to get a hold of 7 light machine guns or auto rifles from the Great War. And me, May, and Ian are taking them for a spin and seeing how they do. So keep an eye out for that project to launch. It is my hope that we will still have regular C&Rsenal episodes at the same time. However, we've effectively doubled our overhead for the next month. So if I'm not getting back to you on the myriad of ways you guys can reach me through social media, yeah, I might not get back to you for like a week at a time. It's going to be very hard for me to answer emails and do this. I apologize in advance, but wish me luck, because we are going to knuckle down and power through this, and hopefully you guys will have a very interesting February. All right, with all that covered, I have one last thing to say, which is I want to thank Georges, what's the Greek George? Anyway, my newest best friend has been sending me some great images. I've put at least one other on Instagram, but this thing is also hilarious to me. I don't know why, but these are just really making my day. All right, the rest of you, have a good time. Bye-bye.